Okay, well, I'd like to welcome everybody to the AES December 2022 presentation on audio loudness techniques for new platforms. My name's Kean, Chair of the Audio Engineering Society in Melbourne Section. First, there's a bit of housekeeping. For tonight's session, we'd appreciate keeping microphones muted unless identified to speak or instructed otherwise. There will be some time at the end of the sessions for general questions and discussion. Please use the chat feature to prompt us with any questions as you think of them to ensure we do not miss them. The perceived loudness of delivered audio program material can vary widely, especially across many modern sources, including speech, music, and multimedia content, podcasts, and even voice responses from so-called smart devices. The AES Technical Council on Broadcast and Online Delivery has been addressing this issue, completing their technical document TD 1008 on loudness measurement. This document includes recommendations of interest to the industry. Tonight, we are privileged to have a presentation by John Kean on this interesting and important topic, and really appreciate this, also given the time difference with USA and Australia. John Kean has had over 40 years experience in television and radio broadcast, including as Project Director, National Public Radio, NPR, and leading technical studies with that company. More recently, John has been working with Cavill Mertz in USA and quite a few other areas that he's been working. John has received Engineering Achievement Awards from NAB and the Association of Public Radio Engineers, or APRA. He has chaired studies with AES and APRA relating to broadcast audio, including on aspects of human perception, a topic of interest to me. John has also published chapters of the NAB Engineering Handbook. For the past 2 years, John has been active in coordinating the work of AES Technical Group TD 1008 and is now extending this work with the new Loudness website on AES. We will now hear about this work. Now, I'd like you to temporarily unmute your microphone, so go find the button, and then I'd like you to give John a warm welcome, thanking him for the presentation tonight. Okay, now I'd like to hand over to you, John, and if you need me, well, I'm here. Thanks, John.
Wonderful, thank you, Graham. It's an honor to be speaking to you all. This is one of the largest AES groups that I've spoken to in a while. So I am impressed with the Melbourne section. I will have the opportunity someday to come and visit you face to face. I think that would be a lot of fun for me. So I also want to thank Peter Smurden for arranging this. His expertise was a big help in getting me on schedule here at about 4:36 in the morning. It's still dark here, but we'll see whether I'm wide awake. As we were discussing before the meeting started, your questions by chat are welcome, and Graham's going to keep an eye out for any that are piling up and let me know just in case I'm not reading the chats regularly. So I am interested in your feedback during our presentation on how you feel the management of audio on various platforms works for you all. Here in the States, we continue to have differences in how audio is handled, not only across platforms, and by that I mean that could be you listen to a podcast and then you switch over and you listen to streaming audio, or you listen to the virtual assistant speaking from your smart speaker. All of those kinds of platforms seem to still have differences in loudness. And we've thanks to the ITU and the EBU in Europe, tackled how to measure loudness and even manage it in its production. But once it gets to the listener, to all of us, we still notice differences in loudness. And that was the reason for starting this project a couple of years ago to write loudness guidelines. And I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen. Well, let's save a little time and just move forward here. So these slides are ones that I prepared last winter to brief the technical council in the AES, the one called the Broadcast and Online Delivery, or BOD, Technical Council. They're our parent organization, and they have been very supportive and were interested in knowing our work. So in this slide, I'm simply explaining the growth of audio streaming as one example of a form of audio. And you can see that in the future, it's expected to continue to grow. So audio streaming is a major form of delivery, and one of those that really deserves management of audio loudness management. So to save a little time here, I'll just go off the script and do this ad hoc. These are the co-chairs of the Broadcast and Online Delivery Technical Council in our AES. David Bialik was the one most involved. He met almost every one of our meetings and has been very involved since. The Broadcast and Online Delivery has about 90 members in it, in the Technical Council. And we actually tried to start writing guidelines with that group, and it was pretty evident that we weren't going to succeed. It's managing cats, and it was a very slow process. Everyone wanted to chat, and so I suggested, why don't I set up a small group of people, and we work independently and then just keep you briefed. And they thought, oh, that's a great idea. So this is the group, and it's really a who's who of gentlemen in the audio profession, and a delight to work with. Having that small group really gave us the opportunity to be efficient. And it still took us a year and a half to write the technical document, but we managed to get through it, and it was a delight to work with them. So we're talking about the distribution of audio-only content, and for this technical document, our recommendations are for entities in the delivery chain tasked with normalization of content loudness. This is before streaming or download by end users. And these are typically a branded streaming service, an on-demand content provider, and we probably all use on-demand music, or an online radio station. The new technical document focuses on distribution of audio-only content to consumers rather than the recommendations for content creation. However, content creators, we think, and producers should find it essential in their work. It's not intended for sound with picture distribution. There are already guidelines in place for video and sound with picture content. The primary goals of the new TD are to establish appropriate loudness for streaming and on-demand file playback, optimize distribution and the listener experience, recommend a consistent real-time production loudness target for streams, ensure loudness consistency between sources such as on-demand files, interstitials, streams, and so on, and prevent excessive peak limiting or other processing from degrading perceived audio quality, and finally, encourage the use of audio metadata. I'm going to just speed through this slide that I prepared. I wanted to illustrate the history of audio development, and I've added in some of the major documents here, starting with the Advanced Television Systems Committee in 2008 or 2009. They actually needed to come up with a solution for loud commercials on television. And during the 2000s, they met and developed a system using metadata, which I'll talk about a bit toward the end. The EBU was, of course, early in this and pioneered guidelines, which we call EBU R128. In 2016, the Audio Engineering Society added their first document, TD 1004, which, even though it was early, didn't get a lot of traction. And that's part of the reason we felt we needed to write a new document, the TD 1008 that we're talking about. The Audio Engineering Society's gone on to generate standards for video, AES 71, and that helped launch the ANSI standard, which just came out last year, ANSI CTA 2075. And here's our document. And then I made a note there about the future. The reason is that we see this as an ongoing process. This is just another step, not the final solution, which we'll talk about in a bit. So the new TD addresses loudness normalization for distribution media before reaching the consumer for playback. The following diagram from the document will show how the distribution workflow is handled according to the type of content and normalization technique. If the content is mixed speech and music or assorted, the speech may be separable and measurable. In that case, we adjust content so speech is at -18 LUFS or LUFS before transmission. If not measurable, one normalizes the entire content to the distribution loudness, and that's covered in Table 2 of our document, and covers various radio style formats. If the content is all music, then there are two normalization methods. If the content, we use an album path, and we can see that here on the diagram, which defines the method where the loudest track in an album is normalized to -14 LUFS, and the rest of the tracks are less than this, usually up to 2 LU lower. If this method is not practical, each track can be normalized, in which case all the tracks are leveled to -16 LUFS before transmission. So we prepared a chart here to illustrate the normalization process, and I'm sure many of you who are involved in the production and preparation of audio are familiar with this. To reach a desired or target loudness, original content is usually normalized, as shown in this figure from the TD. When the content loudness is lowered, it is called downward normalization. For example, to reach a target of -18 LUFS, content measuring -13 LUFS is just reduced by 5 LU. It's advisable to raise the content whose loudness is below -18 LUFS, but TD 1008 covers exceptions such as wide dynamic range content discussed in the document. And that's something that's very subjective. We're talking about fine arts programming or classical music content, which may have a level of less than -18 LUFS, and it may not be practical or aesthetically suitable to raise it to -18, or if it's music to -16. This can require peak limiting in the cases we're showing here. If distributors want to avoid peak limiting, they can use partial normalization instead, and that's discussed in the document. The new TD addresses the distribution of music content in either of two fundamental ways. Album normalization preserves the relative loudness between songs in an album and across albums. This is the preferred method because it preserves the artist's intent and maximizes compatibility between musical genres. Musical streaming services often normalize this way, even though the songs may be shuffled. In radio-style production, music is played out sequentially, and tracks are adjusted individually to similar loudness. However, this technique alters the artist's intent by having some songs louder or softer than intended. This diagram illustrates the techniques for album and track normalization. The original album with 4 tracks in this little diagram is shown on the left. Each track of the album is measured, and the integrated loudness is shown by the dashed bars. You notice those little brown dashed bars there. In album normalization, the loudest track, which is -11 in this example, is adjusted to the recommended distribution loudness of -14 LUFS. Here, I'll turn this on and see if this actually operates. There we go. So you'll notice that all of them are moved together in album normalization. The same -3 dB adjustment is done to the remaining tracks as well. Studies show that the spread in track integrated loudness within albums is about 2 to 3 LU, and that's because popular music albums are already pretty substantially processed. In track normalization, right here, each track is lowered by different amounts to provide a uniform loudness of -16 LUFS. However, this technique alters the differences in loudness of the original tracks. Peak levels of the original tracks may exceed 0 dB true peak, but in this example, peak limiting is not required because levels are always reduced. Wide dynamic range content has special considerations. That's the classical music we were just talking about, and that's also discussed in the document. Loudness metadata, and that's something that I'm really excited about. That'll be the next phase in this whole project. Is going to play a key role in the future of online audio. This is an evolutionary process that may take a few more years to complete. Metadata indicating loudness of the content can be included in the stream. The original audio is passed to the player non-destructively. The player can use the metadata to normalize the audio loudness according to the goals of TD1008. This can achieve loudness consistency and artistic balance across different content. Metadata may also be used in the player device to reduce dynamic range of content to adapt to the device's output capability, the environmental noise level, and the listener's taste. The listener may control this process, or the player may apply it automatically according to loudness conditions. The original audio is preserved, and automatic adjustment is available on the consumer side. Most new mobile devices and soon HTML5 compliant browsers can respond to audio metadata. However, time is needed to replace older devices without this capability. These techniques are fully established in video services, and within a few years, I hope, online audio guidelines can fully converge with these video standards that have already tackled the use of metadata. So we are talking about an evolutionary process here, and we hope the next to the last step. As a reminder, TD1008 is evolving and will provide loudness management features to help in noisier listening environments and full dynamic range content when desired by listeners. Loudness and DRC, or dynamic range control, metadata are already well established in video production and distribution. For audio content in the consumer players, it is currently emerging, as we were just talking about. Until metadata is added to online content and players support it, TD1008 recommends loudness that is well suited for current fixed and mobile listening. So it's a compromise, to put it in a word. To advance the process, TD1008 is creating an awareness for metadata encoded streams in future consumer future consumer devices, complying with CTA 2075, which is the guide you see on the right. And here's table 1 from the document, which I thought was kind of an intimidating table. It's got a lot of numbers and very brief titles, and it doesn't really make it too easy to follow. So what we're going to do here is break it down into sections one by one. So I've color-coded the sections. We'll begin with the assorted category, which includes, pardon me, which includes radio-style streams, sports, and podcasts containing speech. Musical performances and music with or without effects are also part of this category. Now, if the speech segments can be separated from music and effects content, it is measurable. This is usually done with automatic software, but it may also be done manually during production. This measurement is called dialogue integrated loudness. Speech then serves as the anchor for content loudness, which is recommended at -18 LUFS. Sometimes, however, speech loudness cannot be measured reliably, such as with a music bed or sound effects under speech. When speech is not measurable, there is, quote, no separable speech anchor, unquote. In this case, the recommended integrated loudness is determined by the content format, which is covered in Table 2. Music can be instrumental or vocal music, with or without spoken elements. You may notice that music at -16 LUFS is shown 2 LU greater than speech. Listening tests have found that speech normalized to the same integrated loudness as music is typically perceived 2 to 3 dB louder than the music. So this table helps compensate for that difference. As we shall see later, track normalization is easiest, but it's not preferred for listening quality. Album normalization maintains the relative track loudness of the album as intended by the content creators. In this case, only the loudest track is aligned to -14 LUFS, and the remaining tracks run below this, typically down to -16 LUFS. And here's the interstitials part. They're a less familiar name for short form content, and those could be commercial ads, promotional or public service related material. These are typical in duration of less than 3 minutes. Because interstitials usually contain speech, the distribution loudness is -18 LUFS. If they are much greater than the main content, listeners can be annoyed. At least I think most of us are. Announcements from digital devices like smart speakers and car dashboards are referred to as virtual assistants. That dialogue is now combined with other content audio, making audio loudness a consideration. A loudness of -18 LUFS is recommended for compatibility. However, these digitally generated announcements may include alert messages that need to be heard above the background noise. Thus, an upper tolerance does not apply. There's the NA that you see in that column. So to recap, the recommended distribution loudness is determined by the content type. An upper tolerance is provided for measurement error and variance. Keep in mind that the LUFS values are negative, so a positive tolerance raises the loudness. So a -18 LUFS with a +1 tolerance allows up to -17 LUFS. Speech is the preferred anchor because studies with mixed content show that listeners tend to set their playback volume with speech elements. Due to the 2 LU offset between speech and music, as the proportion of music in mixed format programming increases, the closer the loudness is to the upper tolerance of -16 LUFS. This is covered in detail in Table 2, which we'll get to next. Here we are. Table 2 in the technical document is particularly relevant to distributors for radio-style audio processing. Some providers, such as commercial radio stations using radio-style audio processing, cannot control speech and music separately. They just run everything through the same audio processor. They should instead use a single distribution integrated loudness for the entire stream. Table 2 shows examples of radio style formats. You see those in the format column, and integrated loudness for each that will interoperate well with streams where speech and music loudness are managed separately per Table 1. For example, a format that is news talk is primarily speech and should operate at -18 LUFS. A format that is primarily popular music can operate at -16 LUFS, while a mixed format is recommended at -17 LUFS in between the two. Integrated loudness applies to the entire stream. Providers will balance the loudness of elements within the stream as they prefer. So a natural question is, why should one follow these recommendations in the guideline document? There are a number of benefits to your listeners in doing it. I think we could agree that listeners can be annoyed when the relative loudness changes as they switch audio streams or content. These guidelines reduce those loudness shifts. Listeners abhor commercials that are too loud. That was the big problem in the 2000s with television that we were just talking about. These guidelines help maintain consistent interstitial element loudness. One is to preserve the artistic intent of the content creators. Some dynamics are an important element of a performance and should be maintained. Audio systems have a wide range of acoustic output capability and are heard in many different noise environments. The guidelines recommend these variations and provide information to help optimize the listener experience. I guess you have to sort of take my word for it, since we're not going through the text of the document, which is pretty detailed. With some online services delivering content at high loudness, it's natural to ask if -16 to -18 LUFS is loud enough for listeners. I'll mention that one writer for a technical journal that's read by a lot of radio engineers was using the shower radio example, and he was thinking that you really needed to compress audio even more to satisfy those listeners like him with a shower radio with a lot of background noise. For one, few consumer devices lack the internal gain to provide usable output. I think that would apply to a lot of inexpensive shower radios. A cell phone is another good example, and it does not have the acoustic power to overcome the noise level of some noisy environments. But we think this would be asking too much of any tiny speaker. In most cases, earphones are called for, and raising the distribution loudness is not the technical answer. Nearly all commercial music content have loudness levels that fit the loudness guidelines. That's, as we were saying earlier, is that most popular music is pretty heavily processed before distribution. So no further processing is needed. Excessive processing of audio content harms the experience for most listeners, we believe, by sacrificing the aesthetic quality and adding undesirable artifacts. Complying with the guidelines is easy. The Table 1 recommendations, that is -18 speech anchoring and album normalization to -14 LUFS, requires little or no dynamic compression for popular music and speech programs. And this produces an online product that is preferred by listeners because they're hearing it the way the album and the individual songs were actually produced and not going through additional processing. The recommended treatment of music albums, static loudness normalization, preserves the artist's intent and can provide a more enjoyable experience for listeners. When album normalization is impractical, providers may follow simple guidelines in our Table 2 and they may also use radio-style audio processors, heaven forbid, to make speech and music content more consistent and create a signature sound. The document also provides a large section with technical notes on subjects ranging from adding interstitial content and automated announcements to music and speech content, controlling peaks when normalizing audio loudness, dealing with monophonic distribution, and more. There's a full glossary for technical terms and a bibliography of related research, industry standards, and relevant technical articles on audio loudness. So you've heard me kind of croaking along here at 5 in the morning. I'm going to take a little break for a sip of coffee. And before I go on to talk about audio metadata, which is something that I'm excited about, I thought I would see if we have any questions. And so I'll stand by here for a sec.
Thanks, John. There are questions out there. There's been very few coming in on the chat. One question. One question. So I'll start it off. One of the questions that I had was this issue of managing the peak to average and the dynamic range. Some of the work that I'd seen with the hearing aid environment tackles that, because you just can't keep turning the level up. You've got to manage the high level and therefore the spread of dynamic range. Mm-hmm. I would presume that this would be consistent with some of that work.
That's true. And the technical document does specify that if you are normalizing to an increase in loudness, let's say you have beautifully recorded studio speech and you want to normalize it to the negative 18 LUFS that we recommend for online content, that may require peak limiting in order to ensure that you don't exceed the system limit. We actually recommend levels below -1 dBTP in order to provide a margin for encoders and digital compression, which can increase the crest factor of the audio. So that would be an example where, peak limiting is a natural part of the requirement. So it'd be much like what they do in digital hearing aids these days of providing some kind of protection against overload. Of course, the peak limiters that we can use are much more sophisticated and we think, less audible than what you can do in a tiny hearing aid.
Thank you for that. I'm not sure whether the audience is familiar with the loudness units, the LU and the LU full scale, LUFS. And what was interesting to me was the perceptual aspects for that the loudness units take into account the perceptual aspects. Do you want to clarify that?
There was a study starting in the late 1990s on this to find a measurement principle that correlated with our ear's sense of loudness. We're all familiar with the use of other metering, and I'm sure you all have used VU meters in your equipment. Is that pretty familiar? Yeah. Even though that was developed in around 1936 by Western Electric and the Bell Telephone System in the U.S., that metering has been a standard. Since then, we've had electronic meters that indicated peak level or RMS. And those have been helpful, but they didn't really solve the problem of managing loudness of content from element to element. Certainly, peak indication is a poor indicator of our sense of loudness. And so what we've had to do is ask engineers who produce the content to use their ears in balancing. And that's still the most appropriate way to mix any audio. But the advantage of a loudness meter is that it can provide an objective measurement. And that's really helpful in setting targets which couldn't be done by ear in an automated manner. So the ITU introduced a standard, and that's in the bibliography of our document, which describes how that's measured. And I'll just mention that I'm going to show you in a little bit here a website that the Audio Engineering Society is going to be introducing early next year, and that will explain how the ITU loudness meter works. But it does provide an indication of loudness in 3 different ways: integrated loudness, short-term, and momentary. And without getting into those details, those are all very valuable tools in measuring audio loudness and applying it in these elements that we're talking about here.
I think, John, that's a whole new talk.
Yeah, the internal
an
workings.
Interesting one, but yeah, thanks for that.
Yeah, that's why we're building this website, and I guess I've sort of found myself as the editor for that, and have been working on that for the past year since the completion of the technical document. But we think this website's going to be very helpful. As a matter of fact, why don't I go ahead and see if I can bring that up. If I can get...
While you're finding that, we did have another question come in, so I'll relay that when you're back.
Great. Let me... There we go. So are you seeing a web page now?
Yes.
Good. All right. So I'll leave that up, and please go ahead with the question.
Okay. The question came in from Bill Gelhaus, and it's to everyone. Where's Bill? I was trying to find you. You'd probably wave. Bill's question was, if you are producing a basic music stream where the source material library is of various level and album normalization, is it practical or not practical to try to normalize each track in the library when it could be 20,000 tracks or more?
Yeah, it is technically possible, and it has been done to normalize every track in the library. However, that's even though it's technically possible and has been done, not recommended. As we were talking about in the presentation, you saw how track normalization levels out every audio track, let's say it's a song, to the same loudness. And that takes away the artist's original intent of having some songs that are appropriately softer or louder. So the technique that would be preferred in our view is album normalization, and that requires measuring every track in the album, as we were illustrating, and finding the loudest track, adjusting that to negative 14 LUFS, and then all other tracks in the album are less than that. Statistically, sum up to about negative 16 LUFS or negative 17 LUFS. There's only a 2 to 3 dB variation in loudness across popular music albums. So that's how that technique works. Did that answer the question?
John, would that typically be done by software?
Yes. Normalizers are commercially available, and there are even some free ones now that can be used. And what they do is at a high speed, they ingest an audio file containing, say, a song, and then measure the integrated loudness using the ITU standard. And so they can do that in a flash, and then save the loudness, integrated loudness value of that song, and then can ingest the next song in an album, collect all of those together, and then apply album normalization. So that's, quite possible now.
Thanks, John. Avinash Oak made the comment, analog VU indicated loudness in any case. Did you want to expand on that, Avinash? Where's Avinash?
Yeah, I'd love to hear a little more about that.
I've got to find him. Are you there?
Yeah.
Is his mic on?
Good evening. This is Avinash. I actually wondered that if we had this analog VU RMS kind of a value and it was matching with the loudnesses, then what is the real idea of having this LUFS business?
You're asking what is the value of using integrated loudness?
Yeah, I mean, like if we go back to analog kind of this VU meters, it will solve the whole problem, because that that shows us the loudnesses in any case. So why this very complicated LUFS system?
It does seem kind of complicated, doesn't it? And devices like the VU meter are certainly simple and very familiar. And actually, in spending a lot of time reading and studying this, I developed a greater respect for the old VU meter. It actually does a decent job of indicating the loudness of program content, not as well as the ITU standard meter does, but it actually is quite good. The intention, though, was to make it even more accurate, and also to be able to measure what we call integrated loudness, which is over the duration of a maybe a song, or it could be a 1 hour radio program or podcast. The ITU standard and the EBU R128 and the other EBU documents provide explicit guidance on how to do that measurement. It could have been done with the VU meter, but it's done more accurately, and perceptual testing shows that the ITU loudness meter does correlate the best of any metering we have available, and that's the reason that it's generally recommended. It seems like a kind of complicated meter, when you look at the standard, the ITU standard, but it's actually fairly easy to implement in software, and and there's free software for doing measurement, as well as a whole host of commercial products. So it's really a matter of just getting more accurate with the measurement. And also it has the, besides the integrated measurement, which considers the entire duration of an audio element, it has short-term loudness measurement, which has a dynamic that looks surprisingly like a VU meter in its movement. And so I tend to use short-term measurement in my mixing. There is also an even faster one called momentary loudness.
Yeah.
And it's a matter of taste, but it has those other capabilities that we don't have in the VU meter.
Yeah.
Oh, thanks for that. Thanks for
Yeah. Yeah.
So, yeah, I would invite everyone to do some research. I'm sure that in Australia, the ITU loudness meter is starting to show up in some mixing environments and streaming centers. Is that true or not true?
Please comment. Please comment.
Here in the U.S.,
a stunning silence.
Yeah, maybe it's not, and this is a good reason to be talking about it. In the U.S., it's becoming well known and is starting to be used pretty widely in content distribution. That is, the organizations that stream audio or distribute podcasts, that National Public Radio. I'm not sure, is NPR known in Australia?
It certainly is by me.
Sure is.
Is it?
Yeah, yep.
I'm a big fan of the BBC, but NPR is sort of the BBC of the States, and distributes every day hundreds of elements of audio online, and in fact, it's available anywhere in the world. Every one of those files is normalized to a target loudness, and they are adopting this TD 1008 principle or process. So it's become very widely used. The European Broadcasting Union has been pioneering this for about 12 years now, and it is universally used in Europe for program content distribution, either online or even over the air in some cases. So it sounds like something that Australia can start working on.
Yes, the silence we met about the ITU loudness metering reminded me of one item. How would the automated LUFS systems handle John Cage's silence piece?
It's a gated measurement, and it will freeze during any lapse in sound. Of course, if the entire song, so to speak, is silent, I don't know, that may be mathematically impossible to measure. But if you have pauses in audio or the content drops below the threshold of measurement, it stops averaging that audio and resumes when the audio rises above a floating threshold. I wanted to mention that because somebody was going to come back and say, well, what is the threshold? And it's actually a floating computation, but it does pause in determining integrated loudness during lapses in audio.
It sounds like we've got two test pieces then. We've got the shower radio and the John Cage piece to the two ends of that spectrum. Okay, now questions, please. Anybody got questions, please?
Yeah, it's interesting to sense that this technology is relatively new there, and that's the reason that I was supporting the development of a website dedicated to loudness measurement and the techniques for using it. And that's what I have up on the screen. Now, this hasn't been shown to anyone else yet. In the next few weeks, we are going to share it with that Broadcast and Online Delivery Technical Council, the BOD, with about 90 members. But they haven't seen it yet, so I'll say, shh, don't tell anyone that you're actually the first to see this. But this is actually a live web page. It's only a developmental version, so some things here haven't been built into it yet. But as you see, it has the Audio Engineering Society logo. It is going to be hosted by the AES. It's going to be free. It's not behind a paywall, and it's going to be available to everyone, not just AES members. We thought that this measurement of loudness and application of it is so important that we should make it available to everyone. And so this is the landing page. So if you're on the AES website and some other section, you'll be able to jump to this, or you'll be able to go to something like aesloudness.org, and anyone in the world will be able to land on this page. We're going to work on improving our pictures here, but this follows the new AES website format for content. You may have noticed that the AES website completely rebuilt their website using a company in London named Copperleaf, and I've been working with Copperleaf to set up this website. What we want to do is explain the loudness basics. Some of the questions that you all have been asking, how does this measurement work? And why do we need it? And then loudness normalization, which is how do you apply a loudness measurement to a music album, or to a streaming music service, or to an on-demand music service like Pandora, for example. Is Pandora used in Australia?
Yes.
And Spotify, I suspect, is used. Yeah.
Tidal.
Okay. And they are using loudness normalization. So what they're doing is they're ensuring that the music is played back at compatible levels rather than varying widely depending upon how the original producers handle loudness. What we're hoping is that they're also going to bring those compressed content down to lower levels and eventually permit greater dynamic range. We're seeing in commercial popular music loudness levels as high as -10 LUFS, which requires a lot of processing, a lot of compression and loss of dynamics to operate that high. But nevertheless, services like Pandora and Spotify are using target levels now that are well below that, around -14 LUFS, as we recommend. And that gives the content creators opportunity to bring more dynamics into the music. So we have the third section here, which is called Insights from Professionals, and that will allow people who are experts in the audio industry to write about their own experience with the use of loudness measurement in their production and distribution, as it says here. I'm going to show you the one link that's working. Yeah, go ahead, Graham.
I was going to say that that's going to be popular. The perceptual aspects for loudness would be covered in that first area, which you're about to open.
Yep.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
This is the loudness basics section.
You're testing our speed reading here.
Yeah. And it's probably rather fine print for you. I apologize, since I'm running it at 2560 horizontal resolution. But we have sections on why does audio loudness matter? I think that came up today. And it's a natural question. Why would we use a loudness meter when we've been used to using VU meters and getting by just fine? So we talk about that. I put in some kind of a gallery of meters. Here's the VU meter. I've got to get this reordered. They Copperleaf put it in the wrong order. This VU meter should be over one to the left. And we evolved to this bar graph meter after the VU meters, of course. And then finally over here is a little thumbnail of a software-based loudness meter, which provides a whole range of information about the audio, and can also display measurements temporally. You see here a moving chart of the short-term loudness of a segment of music. This all started over here in the 1920s with the volume indicator, which again was a meter developed by the Bell system in the U.S. for the telephone system and distribution of audio content. And it was a rectified audio analog moving pointer, and was the forerunner to the VU meter. The VU meter introduced a greater scale range and better markings, and had a standardized rectifier. So it was quite an improvement, and a lot of work went into its development, and of course has been around for a long, long time.
John, I've got a question in here from Bill. And Bill, are you there?
I think so.
Oh, good. I can read your question. It is, what if you don't have access to the album as a group of works? The original source might be selections from a live concert, then followed by a cut from a 20s recording. Access to the albums might not be practical. The material is more of the classic nature, not pop. So I think he's asking there, how do you manage this over a wide range of broadcast and source material? Is that right, Bill?
Pretty much, yeah. I've inherited a library of 20,000 cuts. Some are transferred from tapes, from live concerts. Some are from CDs. Some are from vinyl, shellac, wax, take your pick. How do you... right now they're all over the place as far as the absolute level goes.
Well, there are a couple of ways of approaching this, Bill. One is to normalize all the cuts. It may sound like a big job, but actually if you had a large number of audio cuts from different sources that you need to play out, pretty likely it would be transferred to digital file storage. And once that's done, it's very easy for software to normalize according to its audio loudness with the ITU, the level of each cut. And it normally is done without touching the material. Only metadata is added to indicate what the loudness of that particular track is. However, it's possible for the software to also readjust the loudness to a target and store it back again. That's the sort of thing that NPR is doing every day with hundreds of audio files. In the NPR system, there are producers all across the U.S. Uploading material. They might be podcasts, they might be news reports, they might be part of a music production, and they're actually required to normalize them before they upload, but nevertheless, they have an automatic system that measures the loudness of each submission and normalizes it to NPR's specifications. So that's one approach. The other is that the loudness could be monitored in real time and adjusted accordingly. So there are two ways of doing it. Did that sort of answer your question, Bill?
Yeah, it's kind of handles the front end. Okay, now how does the normalization? I'm assuming when you normally normalize, okay, you're using waves. What if the library has been MP3'd to death? Does the normalization work on that reasonably well?
Yeah, it can. Any content can be measured with the ITU loudness meter, and loudness software can normalize it. So it doesn't matter whether it's been digitally compressed for data size or not. It will work fine either way.
Sounds like you've got some challenges there, Bill.
Yeah, it's an interesting project.
Yeah, but the nice thing is, Bill, if you're transferring this audio to digital storage, I assume you're doing that.
It's already been transferred once. It's on MP3 format. Yeah.
Okay.
That's the problem.
Oh dear.
Yeah. Well, then probably the thing to do is to use metadata to mark each file for its loudness, so that the playout system will know right at the beginning of the file whether to make any adjustment in gain for playout, and then you've managed to even out differences in the source content. It's in the normalizing process. It's with compressed content like MP3 or AAC, not a good idea to readjust the level, because that involves another stage of transcoding. You have to decode the MP3 back to linear audio to perform the measurement, and then you make the gain adjustment, but then you have to write it back to a file, and there's another generation of transcoding. So that introduces artifacts. But fortunately, metadata can be tagged onto your file, which leaves the audio completely alone. So that would be my recommendation. And fortunately,
that's kind of the way I was feeling. That
it
would be better, so you don't muck with the original recording or the original compressed recording.
Right, absolutely. Even the linear files, those stored in the WAV format, can be tagged with metadata.
John, perhaps
Yeah.
could you expand on the on metadata aware playout systems? Are they common now?
No. And that's a good segue actually to talking about the rest. Anyway, I'll just
Maybe if we
finish up with this slide. Sorry?
I was just going to say that we can go back to the non-shared screen, but
Yeah.
there you go. You're reading my mind.
Good.
Okay, now Rad, that's James, isn't it? Rad, was that? There you are. You can unmute because we can't hear you. Yes, you were saying manual users indicate a preference for analog movement pointers.
Yeah,
Yes.
we are primarily a classical and some jazz broadcaster, community radio, a bit like the PBS, but also stream, as does one of our colleagues on my left, Chris Deacon. We have stuck with the BBC pseudo PPM, with the BBC scaling, and in discussion with some of the commercial broadcasters, they found that when they went from conventional analog pointer type meters to LED bar graphs, the levels all went up. And one of the arguments was that the operators like to see all the lights. And it goes with the commercial radio thing, the louder the better. I want to be louder than the opposition, which of course in our case it doesn't work because of classical music. And we are acutely aware of the problems of silence, particularly if we're broadcasting stuff like opera.
Yep.
Interesting argument, but most of our operators are quite happy with the pseudo PPM BBC scale, although in our master control area, we use the EBU scaling, -12, +12, test in the middle.
This could be another whole program of discussion about choices of meters. And I have the greatest respect for the BBC's PPM. Probably, let's see, when I was at NPR in the 1980s, I started studying that because at NPR, we always had complaints about the difference in loudness from content that was produced in the field by member stations and then sent in, not matching other content and not matching what was done in the NPR studios. It was a constant problem and led to complaints. And NPR did not compress its content to send it back out to the stations. It had a goal of high quality, and so they felt that they weren't going to do more compression. So that was a big problem. And I started looking at other metering. And the BBC peak program meter, you may know, was actually developed in the 1930s. And they put a great deal of thought into it. And it was not a cheap meter. Back in the 1930s, it actually took a rack of tubes, a rack space of tubes in a chassis to run the meter. But they felt that it was useful. It is a quasi-peak reading display. It's not completely instantaneous the way some of the more modern meters that are used in some equipment and consoles operate. And that was because back in the 1930s, the overload characteristic of vacuum tubes was not sharp, and therefore there was some latitude for allowing the very fastest of peaks to go into the overload region of tube amplifiers. So it was a great concept, and it worked very well, although it also required quite a bit of training. Unlike the VU meter, where you could tell anybody without training, well, just keep the meter, going up near 0 VU, but don't let it go over. And that would work pretty well for a variety of radio content, music and news and documentaries, all of that. That would do fairly well because the VU meter was so reasonable at indicating our ear's loudness. The problem with the PPM is that it was a quasi-peak reading meter, and you had to train operators on how to associate different types of content with different indication on the scale. You couldn't just peak everything on a PPM to the same place. Otherwise, it disturbed the loudness matching based on the peak to average ratio of the content. And our ears tend to hear more the average, short-term average in loudness. So the PPM has its shortcomings, and it's not something that I think is the best choice anymore. The ITU loudness meter is a good solution for indicating the loudness on a real-time basis using, for example, the short-term loudness dynamics or ballistics. The integrated loudness tells us the measurement over the duration of an entire song or an entire program, and that's useful as well. So the ITU loudness meter gives us a lot of information, and it works well with our hearing because it was developed through perceptual testing to correlate well with our ear's sense of loudness. So it's something that is new. And if you buy a standalone loudness meter, they can be pretty expensive, hundreds of dollars. So, you don't want to buy a whole chain of those to put on top of a console. But usually they're not needed at that stage. You could still use peak reading meters in a console and your ears. You use the loudness meter as the final indicator for, am I producing this podcast or this program at a compatible loudness? So you only need really one meter in that case. And by the way, loudness meters are not stereo. They sum the left and right channel, or if it's multi-channel content, 7.1 Dolby, they combine all of that into one indication, because that's the way we hear it. We only have one pair of ears, so we only need one meter to tell us the loudness.
John, that raises the issue. Who would be the best person to give us the ITU loudness meter evolution talk?
Certainly somebody in our writing group would be good. So you're interested in knowing how did we get to the development of this meter we call the ITU standard? Yeah.
I'm hearing from the members and the people here that they're interested in what happened after the VU meter. And I think we've all had experience with the peak lead meters and the severe limitations.
Right.
Now, there doesn't seem to be a lot of knowledge about where we're heading with the ITU perceptual aspects and the loudness aspects. So it's probably something that's of interest, but maybe I should take it offline and not clog up the meeting. Something of interest. Yeah.
Well, there are papers, and maybe what I could do is send you, for the benefit of the section, some of those papers on the evolution. Yeah. And the other thing is that we'll have the NPR loudness website, the AES audio loudness website up in probably within 3 months. And that will explain the story, I hope, well enough to satisfy the section members. And it, by the way, will have a feature in it so you could post questions and get help. So we're working toward that. One of the things I thought I would just bring up, because I was talking about how this technical document is part of an evolutionary process. In other words, we wrote it with a lot of thought to provide guidelines for the preparation and distribution of content, whether it be audio streaming or on-demand music or podcasts. But we are looking at that as only an interim solution. In other words, it's fixing the problems before it's encoded for distribution, which requires effort, and it also introduces compromises. We are specifying target loudness, for example, for speech at negative 18 LUFS, but suppose you had content with wider dynamic range and you really hated to compress it to bring it up to negative 18 LUFS. That's especially true for classical music. So the final solution, as we see it, is the addition of metadata to all of the audio which is distributed to listeners. And the metadata is embedded in the audio and provides information to the playback device, which could be in our portable player, it could be in our HTML5 browser, it could be in our car dashboard. And the metadata is read and provides information which guides the local management of the playout loudness from element to element. And that can be automatic, and it can be adjusted according to the listener's needs. For example, if you're listening in a quiet living room and you want to hear all of the original dynamics naturally, that is possible. At the same time, that same content can be distributed to somebody who's riding in the bus and wants to be able to hear all of the content within, let's say, a classical music performance. They don't want to have it buried in the noise during part of the performance, and they can set their playback device to manage the loudness, which could include dynamic range, according to their needs or their tastes. So I thought maybe I would give you a little sample of this. Let's see if I can turn on share sound here. There we go. And hopefully you're looking at the other slideshow. Does that sound right, Graham?
Yes, that is correct. We've got the slideshow screen up.
All right.
It's not running. You've got to go into the slideshow if you want to run it.
There we go. So now you got the whole slide.
Yes,
so this is a presentation that I made for the National Association of Broadcasters at their annual conference. And what I was doing here in this presentation was introducing this concept of audio metadata. The standards have already been written for this metadata, and it can be handled automatically by modern codecs like the Advanced Audio Codec, AAC, and Fraunhofer's new version, which is extended high efficiency AAC or XHEAAC. The metadata is read by the decoder and can manage loudness on demand. So what I did is I took the HEAAC codec the Fraunhofer coder, which is very popular and used widely by internet distributors of content. And I took this little 1-minute piece of audio, which you see here on the screen. Let me go back 2 slides. This is the original audio. It was normalized to -24 LUFS, which would be the standard loudness recommended by the EBU for content distribution. And by the way, that's also the standard for the US television, the ATSC standard, -24 LUFS. And I'm going to play a little bit of this. I hope this works. So, Graham, wave at me if it doesn't play. Let's see if I can get, here we go. So this is the original content. It has the metadata in it, but I told the player to not touch the audio. And so what you're hearing is actually the output of the decoder as it would be played in its original form. You can see we're in this little section of the minute here.
That's working fine. It's down in level a bit.
Right. Now it's building. That's a cute little piece of music. It was actually written by one of the members of the AES writing group for TD1008. He works at Google out in California. He calls this the Great Mouse Race. And in this diagram, I embedded a snapshot of the measurement of that piece you just heard. And you can see the integrated loudness is -24.0, right on the mark. And it has a loudness range of 14.8 LU. By the way, this is another feature in the ITU loudness measurement. It can actually tell you what the range of loudness is for any particular piece of content. And it's a very good measure for knowing whether the content needs any further dynamic compression to be distributed. If it's a very large number, say it's 14.8, or it could be in Stravinsky's Firebird, usually measures in the 20s in loudness range because of its huge dynamic range. Wonderful piece of music. All right, now I'm going to switch ahead to save time, and I'm going to go to this slide. This is the very same starting file as the one you just heard. The only thing that has changed is I told the HEAAC decoder to read the metadata and deliver a higher loudness. So if you were driving your car and you got the window down and you want to be able to hear all of his song, this would be the setting that you might choose. But if you're the one listening in your living room and you wanted to hear it in its original form, you would have heard it the way it was in the first take. So here's the same exact file, no change. The only thing was how the metadata was handled for playout. So did that sound louder?
Yes,
you all?
yes.
Okay. The only thing that was changed was the player setting. It was the same file as the first one. And you can see that the integrated loudness now was raised to negative 14.3, and the loudness range was reduced down to 9.8 LU. And of course, if you look at that chart here, you can see how those quiet parts have been lifted substantially, and yet the maximum peak level is virtually identical to the original. These peaks never get to clipping, and that's because it's doing dynamic compression throughout the piece. And it, by the way, does a remarkable job considering how small the program is. The Fraunhofer program that I got under license for this testing is less than 3 kilobytes in size. And it does that kind of a job on the dynamic range compression. I think aesthetically that's pretty nice. It did a nice job with without compression artifacts. The reason it can be that small is it's reading the metadata at an audio block by block rate, a very fast rate. And on every block, it's receiving commands saying, if you want the loudness to be great, then here's the gain setting you set for this audio block. So we're actually hearing commands being sent in at that fast rate, and the decoder doesn't have to work very hard. All it has to do is carry out the gain adjustments that you've chosen for it.
Thanks.
So,
John, can you go back to the non-sharing, please?
Yeah.
That's good. A good demonstration. Sounded louder to me. Okay, there's a lot of interest being generated, and I think we could go on in an informal chat way. I think at the moment that's been most interesting. We've had quite a bit of chatting going on relating to some available software that does some of these things. So that's something to consider. So I think I might have to wrap it up now. I really do want to thank you, John, for taking the time and effort. You probably have some sleep now or coffee, depending on what your choice is. It could be either. If ever you come to Australia, just remember where Melbourne is, and I'm sure we could sort something out for you. But I do, on behalf of the Melbourne section, I would really like to thank you for tonight, because you've done a very good job. Now, at this stage, you can all unmute your microphones, but hold your breath and turn your radios off, please. So I'd like you all to join with me to thank John for taking the time and effort and giving us a most interesting presentation. So thank you very much, John. That's very good.
Thank you.
Thank you, John.
Thanks, John.
Thanks, John.
Thank you so much for your putting up with my scratchy voice here this morning.